I'm going to start this with a day in the life of studio. Not so different from most days, and because we're students and can't help it, the studio jumps and turns at his arrival. The Southern only confirms it. Y'all want to talk to me today? Like I said, we're students and can't help it, so we all stare dumbfounded by the question. Actually, I don't want to talk to anyone. Awesome, early day. Except for Megan. Great. Jeff Kipnis has singled me out before I can even stand in unison with the rest of the studio. Don't you go anywhere, I want to talk to you. Kicking my desk mate out of her chair, he sits relaxed with his hands behind his head, wearing what I can only assume to be another hand-me-down Greg Lynn dress shirt, literally this shirt. Then he hits me with the question, what do you think I think of you? Oh God, I don't know. You think I'm a smart-ass? There's no dispute. Look, I think you're capable of solving the disciplinary problem. Okay, wait, what's the problem? That it's too easy. And now I realize why I'm in trouble. It was my ambiguous demeanor toward my studio project in our previous meeting. Not that I was indifferent to the studio topic at hand, rather that the figural output, under any degree of variation, was simply too simple, or perhaps too satisfactory. Now I've been decreed with what Jeff and Jose argued about the pronunciation of Elan Vital. I titled this talk Curiously Ambiguous, not just because it was predetermined by my perceived enigmatic personality, but because it becomes my driving force for current arguments of figurality and new ideas of figure ground that for the past year, I've been unable to escape. I subtitle my talk, Grounded Figure, Figured Ground, as it alludes to the curiously ambiguous effect I'm arguing could occur at the local condition, allowing figure ground to emerge into a three-dimensional reading. At its most classical roots, figure ground brings us to an Italian architect and surveyor in 18th century Rome. Giovanni Battista Noli surveys the city, illustrating the objects as pochade black figures, leaving the residual spaces of the streets and piazzas as white void. A stark contrast necessary for the ground to recede to the background, and a clear indicator to what is occupiable. It's unavoidable to bring up another Giovanni Battista, also etching away in Rome circa mid-18th century. This particular Italian has consumed much of my time in school this past year, as well as my entire summer break. Giovanni Battista Piranesi, that is. His etchings of Campo Marzio under initial readings are no different than the meticulously surveyed Noli map. However, under closer inspection, there's something puzzling about the way in which objects are situated. There's inexactness to their placements, ambiguous, yes, but by intent, so perhaps even equivocal. This dense fictional archaeological field of objects, beyond the high contrast of figure ground, no longer resembles the Noli map, but through its denseness and displacements, alludes to notions of figure-figure, supported by staged routes of ceremonial event and mythological undertones. Even the denoted marches take on the quality of the figural topiary, forming lines within the interstitial spaces of the compounds. For his own speculative work, Piranesi made catalogues of decorative fireplaces. Full of dense figural patterning, the technique would periodically make its way to the wallpaper, making an incredibly ornate composition of black figure composed against a white background. For Piranesi, looking at wallpaper during that century probably took from one of the three compositional techniques of the time: coherent continuous scenes, wrapping around the walls, and a repeating image interlocking to create a field, probably the latter. Andy Warhol brought figure-figure compositions to the pop art scene via his wallpaper. His 1966 cow wallpaper alludes to the repetitious nature of Piranesi's fireplace and wallpaper etchings, creating an autonomous field. Prior to Warhol's ability to efficiently screen print, he hand-stamped his 1962 S&H green stamps, adding to the quality of inexact repetition. The spaces in between vary, undulating the objects into rotation. Much like the compounds of Piranesi's Campo, would deviate off axis to follow the directional change of the river. 200 years after Piranesi, an American architect took cues from these figure-figure compositions by means of experimentation and personified figuration. John Haydock staged these characters across an equipotential field through various tangential relations, most notably in his Masquerade, Victims of 1984. The same ambiguous, precise inexactness of Piranesi still resonates within Haydock's characters as a means for multiple readings. Wallpapering translated to Haydock in his last works. The figural characters were adorned with dazzle patterning. With no intent on stepping on the toes of the decorated shed, I'll refer to Venturi soon enough. I bring up Haydock's direct reference to World War I battleship patterning for its theories in camouflage. While a category of camouflage, this patterning works in the opposition to the conventional sense of the term. The preconceived notion of camouflage assumes the object blends in low contrast to its environment. Dazzle works in a more conspicuous way. Aware of the irrelevance mimicking an environment is once movement occurs, other notions of biological camouflage and pictorial depth cues were applied. The ships are patterned with high contrast graphics to convey alternative means of perception. Distortions in perceived size, trajectories, and speed occur through gradual changes in scale along a repetitive pattern. The use of zigzags and stripes historically has proven useful for scale distortions, demonstrated by the illusion of the Helmholtz squares, in which the horizontal stripes appear taller than the vertical stripes, despite the fact that the two squares are dimensionally the same. As this graphic conveys perceptual dissonance, I'll refer to it again as a means for ambiguity to applied form. Beyond expedient graphic and illusory qualities, patterning can give sometimes blatant and other times deep indexical readings. It's here that I now reference Venturi. In Princeton, New Jersey, the gate to Gordon Wu Hall blatantly quotes Renaissance motifs via the postmodern technique of patterning the facade in the Platonic geometries. Taking another look at complexity and contradiction, he would appear to be looking less at the Renaissance, but rather the entry gallery of Middleton Park by Lutyens in the early 20th century. Venturi acknowledges ambiguity vis-a-vis pure contradictions, such as in the Century Hall. Lutyens tiles the floor to develop a sense of directionality, yet this trajectory abruptly dead ends at the blank wall. Ironically, in Venturi's attempts to regard ambiguity in order to becloud purism for its disambiguous forms, his contradictions contain a sense of purism rather than a curiosity. Under Venturi's definition of ambiguity, things exist simultaneously under pure antithetical terms. This is what Arnheim argues will inevitably create disorder. Nonetheless, this is the blatant patterning I refer to. Wu Hall operates to make an indexical reference, but through the means of graphic expediency. For a more belabored indexical reading, I switch to the Vanna Venturi house. In this case, pattern is now a direct relationship between the decorative qualities of the shed, tracing the formal qualities of the plan. Venturi denounced the use of the duck for the decorated shed, which would be congruent to the initial readings of the house's facades, flanking the internal program. Pattern emerges through a combinatorial reading of the plan against the facade. Let us inquire the story of the ribbon window on the right versus the iconographic window on the left. How could such a contradiction occur on a symmetrical shed? Looking at the plan, the flanking facades are equal in length, not really an indicator to the unevenness of the windows on the front facade. Categorizing the different windows on both facades, the back is arranged in the order of AAB, while the front has two ribbon windows of CC. The catalyst of the rearrangement of the left C window into a square could be traced to the insertion of the main living bookshelf. This insertion reorders the window of the back facade into BAB with an inevitable new window category, what we'll term D. The left ribbon window on the front facade must now correspond to this disruption. This occurs through a rearrangement into an opposing symmetry. The ribbon window C morphs into the square window D. As that zone of symmetry stops at the bookshelf, the rest of the window leaves a scrap equal to that of B on the back facade. Effectively, the formal qualities of the plan translate to the decoration of the shed, shown here in elevation. The inherent two-dimensional reading of this realized three-dimensional house is not only true for Venturi, but also for Hajduk. Hajduk was clear about his desire to rotate plan to elevation in his projection theories. His painter's studio was a clear indicator of a once planar figure rotating into elevation in its development from illustration to realized installation. From Hajduk and Venturi, a step towards three-dimensionality via weak form is introduced by Robert Solmol. And his proposal of the decorated duck under the instructions of Green Dots 101, what he argues is a combinatorial product of Hajduk's figuration with Venturi's decoration, he aims to overcome the preoccupation with criticality in the index for a graphic protocol, all the while being heckled by Peter Eisenman. Solmol offers Neutling's Redux Concert Hall in Bruges as a speculative work conveying the process. If he had to demonstrate a definitive process, a decorated duck is achieved. Ultimately, its operations convey some of the figural perceptions of the dazzled warships, but only in the sense that aggregated components are illustrated as a singular figure through the pattern wrapping all the parts of the whole, the second of the three techniques of wallpapering mentioned previously. It is uniformly adorned in direction and scale, flattening the figure to some degree. Details succumb to the wrapping as well. Its highly perceived repetition makes a definitive edge, unlike the pattern effect of the dazzle ships, which intentionally blurs edges. There is some danger to pattern reaching a level of hyperindexicality, however. It risks only achieving an ornamental quality. Herzog and de Meuron demonstrate this well. The university library, located in Cottbus, Germany, somewhere between Dresden and Berlin, reduces pattern to the applique of a transparent curtain wall, which makes up the entirety of the extruded amoeboid form. The architects formerly known as Foreign Office Associates pulls the applique pattern for layers of transparent wallpaper, but not wallpaper in the same sense as Warhol. Here there's a blurring of intertwining figures rather than a repetitious arrangement of an iconic figure. From there, pattern has been able to justify constructional trends. Herzog and de Meuron do it again in Tokyo, OMA in Seattle, and Reiser and Umimoto in Dubai, but pulling the kitsch constructional pattern from the internal curtain wall. Ultimately, these contemporary works bring pattern to a reducible two-dimensional reading. As we have reached what I'm going to go ahead and say is a dead end for pattern in terms of elevation, perhaps we go back to pattern in respect to the ground. It would be difficult to deny the involvement in patterning with the map building. The patchwork of self-similar parts plugs into an urban context, following to some extent the same Cartesian language, with no scrutiny as to what is figure and ground. But for this argument, I'll give this example different terminology, one which could now be described as ground-ground rather than figure-ground, as it was the goal for Corbusier for Venice Hospital to not emulate a figure, but rather a new ground. Starting from the relative height of the immediate buildings of Venice, the top is densely packed to reiterate the major horizontality of the island. Internally, the hospital mimics the conditions of the existing ground of Venice, translating systems of canals into the residual circulation of the map building. For those who denied modernism, the Italian movements of Archizoom and Superstudio defined object as the new ground, yet always relative to the old ground. Superstudio's continuous monument's new ground condition contrasts the picturesque agrarian setting in favor of stark white grid patterns for infinite indeterminate event space. Never a realized project, it would be hard to say what the three-dimensional qualities of these new grounds would be relative to the way they were represented. It would be possible to imagine Archizoom's no-stop city relative to the qualities of Pier Vittorio Reli's Field of Walls. The pattern translates into the short repetition of walls, laced with various event spaces. The rows allude to a multiplicity of the Segovian aqueduct, left in ruin artifact in the region of Castile and Leon, Spain. Putting Sommel's Heckler under examination, we go back to Germany, on the outskirts of Frankfurt. I looked at Eisenmann's master plan proposal for Rebstock Park for its highly graphic planar representation, a pattern of faceted terrains networked from the connection of the large grid and the small grid. The drawing evokes new qualities of ambiguity. What is figure and what is ground is up to the reader's interpretation. Once realized into three dimensions, the ambiguity subsides. Those devices of representation merely serve as shifts and borders for the extruded buildings. A fully three-dimensional project emerging from pattern has reached yet another impasse at the thick 2D, or what Stan Allen refers to as the moire. I refuse to deny the moire's ability to produce animated effects through the superimposition of regular patterns, provoking moments of intensity and compelling as a planar graphic representation. I will, however, bring into question the figural emergence Allen claims it to have. In plan, the moire fails as the moments of intensity occurs equally across the overlapping grids. As a result, extrusions occur equally, so those intense moments experienced from viewing the moire as a graphic are ineffectual to a reader who resides within the interstitial spaces of the moire, surrounded by monotonous extrusions. In elevation, the effects of the moire would be similar to the FOA example displayed earlier. Compelling visually upon a few layers of surfaces, however, ultimately reduced back to a graphic. The trajectory Stan Allen set with field conditions was a critical step in moving into new contextual arguments. The projection of object to field emerged from arguments of the late 80s and early 90s stuck in the mindset of Leon Krier, or reversely the deconstructivist, a contextual argument in the sense that they were uninterested in context. Much of Allen's speculative works explore pattern fields as a means of figural emergence, but typically through the means of extrusions. In the old town of Maribor, in the northeast corner of Slovenia, Allen proposes an iconographic art gallery which attempts to break away from the inherent horizontality of the field. The field he's composed in this case is embedded with the same autonomous figures of his previous works, the pentagon. The field is composed of 15 units, extruded and chopped at various angles at the top to achieve some figurality. To escape any further readings of an extrusion, or just because Allen likes to enter buildings from underneath, the field is lifted to be held by columns, following through with the same pentagonal language, since the plan is a resultant ground section of the field. In Field Conditions Revisited, Jesse Reiser questions this move. It seems to me that they didn't have to be any more identical than the pentagons above. I'm not sure why those geometries don't just continue to the ground. Alan claims that the sectional idea came before the planar, and both agree that there's too much mezzanine. There's also a disproportionate amount of unusable space involving the light cannons, a result of the supposed vernacularly driven chops at the top, an attempt to conceal a ground extrusion through weak form. Alan's infatuation with pattern evolves into his work through landscape urbanism in his landform buildings, since, as he will reason, pattern historically belongs to landscape. It's true that the typology was reflecting upon the tradition of patterning. However, there's a closer genealogy of patterning within the discipline, tessellation, which makes reference to the notion of mosaic. Historically, mosaic graphic techniques are easily translated into architecture via landscape urbanism, since representation is always portrayed in a large-scale planar view. In these Downsview Park proposals, plans are represented as purely pattern graphics. Exploring mosaic through the medium of art and psychology demonstrates the figural emergence that can occur from pattern. Color block tests will emerge from pattern, for those of you who aren't colorblind, through a slight deviation in the regular color palette. Pointillism uses the same technique of closely patterning dots with varying degrees of color, allowing a figure to emerge from a background. As a contemporary version of Seurat, Close operates under a different technique of painting dots embedded in squares, but effectively achieves the same condition of a figure emerging from the pattern. The quintessential representation of tessellation would be the works of Escher, represented here as birds emerge from an abstracted anamorphic sketch from the agrarian patchwork. Pattern's ability to produce the emergent figure relay much to Alan's interest with the object in the field. However, once pattern is scaled up to superimpose vast infrastructural landscape and vary to embody the numerous indeterminate event spaces, the investigation of pattern in the third dimension is inevitably lost and reflattened into the thick 2D under this typology. While I'm arguing against landscape urbanism, I'm not quick to dispose of landscape altogether. It is a landscape that the object must rely on for a new emergent reading of an ambiguous figure ground condition. Toyo Ito utilizes the immediate landscapes to reflect the same figural qualities of his building. And his design for Taichung Metropolitan Opera House, the continuously rounded, deeply intertwined pattern of the facades translates to the landscape as flattened bubbles of grass outlined in curvy routes of water, an attempt to relate figure and ground, but not ambiguously, as the ground is an ambivalent result of the figural qualities of the opera house. Reiser and Umimoto derived the condition of ambiguity I allude to in their physical model for their Sagaponic house. They developed a string-like regulatory pattern across an undulating landscape. The dense string material is used to represent the house as well. As the house emerges from the landscape, the strings peel, condense, and rotate from the rigid parallel lines of the landscape. It is through the indexical readings of these deviations that you can locate object to its ground. Operating under the same sense that Cubism blended pattern objects into the background, from which new ideas of subjectivity emerged, propositions of the subject abstracted from the world are prevalent in the legibility of the overall figure from the background, despite the relative color qualities of both. As Piranesi has already been discussed, it's no surprise that I should bring up Field of Dreams from the recent exhibition of the Piranesi variations. Not just as the anchor to every figural discussion this year has been tied to, but through our attempt to produce a truly three-dimensional project, had to negotiate a ground condition for the array of animated figures. It is this oscillation between figural object and figural ground that takes RUR's model closer to the level of three-dimensionality I've been seeking. Field of Dreams' reanimated artifact of contemporary works within a morality play is one of the three variations of Piranesi's Campo Marzio. Prominently displaying interest in figure-figure conditions, as well as employing Hayduckian anthropomorphic qualities to the figures themselves, are characteristics brought to the background as well. The figures I'm specifically referring to would be the promiscuous marchers, animated from Andrew Zago's contemporary work of Moke. These characters orgy upon a ground of what appear to be bugs, which actually came about through the use of Papakura, as these are the marchers' unrolled silhouettes. The figures unfold two-dimensionally, deploying into a pattern ground of black voided figure with residual white surface where the maintained three-dimensional figures culminate. While the two projects I have just mentioned, the Sagaponic model and the Field of Dreams, show signs of life in finding three-dimensionality for pattern, it seems fair to remind you that both are stuck in a representative mode, having not been developed past their model stage. A post-rationalized sketch by Madeline Wiesendorp of Casa de Musica in an issue of Hunch shows a planar view of the concert hall with the unfolded form making up the ground condition, much like the example I gave with the marchers and bugs in Field of Dreams. While the realized product of Casa de Musica doesn't create a ground condition under this exact patterning, the point is that it does in fact create a new ground that is authentically contextual for the iconographic object to sit upon. Andrew Zago buys into this representation of figure and ground through the lens of Persian miniature paintings. Under the sectional axonometric view, he renders pattern as what he terms to be misregistration. Typically a displacement of color referential to halftones, he slips patterns from object to ground in a slightly transparent collage technique, therefore transforming figure ground into a pattern condition. The effect of misregistration for a reader interpreting scale behaves much in the same way as a dazzled warship would for a submarine trying to launch a torpedo. There's no ambiguity as to a definitive figure, but the components and scale of the overall figure constantly fluctuates, releasing any monotony that was typical of the thick 2D project. Zago, I would argue, comes closest to bringing back a native disciplinary aspect of pattern, that which was mentioned previously with mosaic. As mosaic historically was constructed through tiling, Zago takes not only scalar shifts from the Persian miniatures, but also the complex applique of the tiles. Delving into pattern to pattern, it has the ability to present contemporary means of communication based on its use as a trope in other forms of popular media. In the film Garden State, the character of Zach Braff for years has been numb to the world due to heavy amounts of antidepressants he consumed after accidentally paralyzing his mother as a kid. As an adult and after the death of his mother, he wears a shirt made for him from a leftover pattern used to decorate the bathroom, the last artifact he has in connection to her. Upon putting it on, he is standing in front of the wall adorned with the same pattern, communicating his general indifference to the situation. The same comedic trope has been used in the art world under the likes of Banksy and Kusama. From this, another illusory analogy relative to the moire, but operating closer to pattern figural emergence, is the stereogram. The stereogram also alludes to the superimposition of self-similar patterns. However, the depth perception effects of the sample begins a dialogue on three-dimensional spatial readings, which differentiates itself from that of the moire. Rather than an equal distribution of intense moments, the stereogram situates within it a singular moment of figure. This was typical when the stereogram was revived and made popular in the 90s by Magic Eye. As you can see, a singular iconic figure embedded within the stereogram and encoded with the same formal patterning as its context. I offer this projection of pattern to pattern not only for its figural emergence, but for what I believe is potential for deep contextual ties to the pattern from which it emerges. Hence, the ambiguous figure ground is termed pattern. For the three-dimensionality I've been harking about, I don't think it's enough to merely project a pattern to a figure in ground. This method tends to lend an after-the-fact surface definition to a determinate figure, such as the use of the Bende dot in a Liechtenstein painting. The pattern is uniformly applied to fill surface, bringing the figure back to a level of two-dimensionality. Likewise, the constructional trend of diamonds applied to the Seattle Public Library uniformly disperses to the surfaces of the weak-form building, adhering to a strict grid-like spacing, giving no priority to any particular surface, maintaining an equal scale and direction. Instead, the elements of the pattern need to individually convey a sense of figure. Take, for instance, a Randall Ash's grotto. Pattern is produced through the process of constructing three-dimensional cell structures, inevitably aggregating a series of non-repeating decahedrons from a self-inflicted point cloud. Reversely, this project isn't emergent of the ground, as installations by nature are self-imposed to a particular site. It drops to the ground at PS1, releasing pieces of boulders radially as a result of a crash. On an indeterminate grassy knoll sits Moss's element house. The triangulated components of prefabricated units combine into a singular figure under a multitude of programmatic possibilities. Unlike the grotto, which began to affect its local condition, the element house does well to keep pattern internal. What if this pattern were applied to the locale they seem to be indifferent to anyway? Here I've continued the pattern of the house to the ground. Do you now read this to have a more relevant formal contextual meaning? And despite the repetition of the pattern, can you still read the difference between figure and ground? Of course you can. You read the indexical deviations of the figure from the background, just as you did with RUR's sagoponic model. You read its animation moving slightly off the boundaries of the plane. Just like the dazzled warships, there should still remain a sense of conspicuity to the figure. It's an important rule of representation in pattern-to-pattern technique to produce a perceptually embodied three-dimensional figure to the two-dimensional background. Jonathan Lasker represents this well in his paintings. Figures are made of the same motif, but the techniques differentiate between what is two-dimensional from what is three-dimensional. Two dimensions are rendered as thin, drafted black lines versus the thick pastel of the three-dimensional. As I refer back to the element house, I pose the question of what could pattern do for the overall three-dimensional reading of the figure. I've examined pattern via plan and elevation in hopes that something in consequence to figure would emerge in the same way the Helmholtz square shifted your perception of scale and direction through a single 90-degree rotation. I believe this can be achieved through the route of misregistration, taking from Zago the expectation of a ground condition, but with the figural identity of the dazzle ships. I offer a hybrid of two works to begin to illustrate this idea that figure no longer grows or illustrates a snapshot of the ground section from the X and Y plane, but rather begins to operate independently in the Z direction. The first is a proposal of a Paris Philharmonic by MVRDV. Each faceted surface is adorned with striped patterns similar to the volume given to the components of the element house. Each stripe is given a thickness and locale along the angled facet, allowing a stream of circulation moving across the pattern both internally and externally as a representation of a park within a park. As such, the emergent icon evokes a dazzled warship grounded within Parc de la Villette. The second example actually replaces Shumi's Park. The Laban Dance Center embeds itself within a sculpted landscape following the same figural language of MVRDV's concert hall. Facets of lawn push up, providing the same surface continuity as the concert hall. Planarly, the combination resembles the graphic representation portrayed in the hypothetical element house layout I showed previously. As it emerges as a three-dimensional object, the combination dazzles with the perceptual shifts in form and scale misregistration suggests, conveying a sense of ambiguity oscillating between grounded figure and figure ground. I look to pattern-pattern relations for moments of figural iconography communicating to its surroundings by means of weaving into the ground, affecting the local condition, to produce a pattern simultaneously defining a grounded figure and its figured ground for a multiplicity of subjectivities, to get out of notions of black and white subjectivity, complex and contradictory, for the curious and the ambiguous. In an interview with Somel, he acknowledges these polar subjectivities by stating, the tendency in many schools producing work is that it seems either self-involved in formal exploration without larger ambition, or socially engaged work that, for lack of a better word, looks like shit if it looks like anything. Then he poses the question, how do you bring those projects together in a way so that the formal project is politically motivated and the engaged project is formally motivated? I take this to heart for what architecture can do to sponsor communities, however, in a less politically motivated sense, and more into the personality architecture can exude. Not to deny that there is a sense of politicality to creating communal clubs or demomons, but I'm more interested in pulling out the formal arguments to the question posed by Somel. Somel pits the self-involved formal project against the politically engaged project, otherwise known as his green dots, the project in favor of graphic expediency. I would align it more to the indexical project wanting expediency, and variance to the graphic project wanting a deeper glance. Under this condition, the figured ground that is produced is a non-normative ground beckoning different personalities. The personality of the grounded figure is differentiated in its form, but literally makes connection to its world. By evolving green dots a little more out of the socially engaged pop art, 2D patterning that is considered in terms of surface, pattern can be moved independently into 3D. Pattern should move past a preconception of vast urban infrastructure, as communities are desperate to reproduce these moments. Instead of regurgitating speculative identities, pattern can become concentrated moments of deep-rooted figural emergence, conveying different readings for various demomons, blurring and breaking down the boundary of identity to reflect upon those who, like me, are also curiously ambiguous. Thank you.
Thanks. Another wonderful talk that was pretty fun.
You can try it.
Okay, hot mic. The presentation you just closed, there was a series of semiotic squares that you flashed. Were we supposed to read the categories as always being consistent? Like where you position the different terms?
Yeah, it's sort of going through an evolution of categorical terms.
So just give me because the curiously, or yeah, can you just, I was curious about that title. I mean, given the nature of the talk, why pattern wasn't more predominant. I was sort of looking for a figure ground talk and a really interesting and complete survey of pattern with certain genealogies and suspicions, but I'm sort of left wondering about, curiously, like what specifically that term contributes to the re-understanding of pattern and figure.
Right. Well, I won't lie that the curiously ambiguous was predetermined, mostly based on my personality, which then sort of translated into what I was looking for with the figure ground arguments. I guess I liked the way it related as far as not being so antithetical, but sort of a in-between to describe that.
I mean, it seems potentially useful. There was a reliance in the notion of patterning. We think of patterning and recognition, a question of legibility, reading through the pattern, and I'm wondering if Curiously would offer a way of getting out of a reading paradigm and into some other thing that you seem to be hinting at. So I think it has a certain kind of usefulness, and perhaps this is already embedded in your conclusion, but is there also a kind of critique of scale that's taking place here? Because you set up the elevational pattern and the urban pattern as two, I don't know, extremes, both of which seem to have certain qualifications. And you go back to a certain kind of scale of the building, and I'm just curious, am I correct in reading a sort of scalar suspicion, or is that more a rhetorical trope for the presentation?
No, there is. I think I find a lot of success in things that occur at representative mode, as far as like planar views as a graphic or in model. And then I guess my critique, once it does get scaled up, I found something that was more successful, like Casa de Musica. It's not emergent of the pattern that Madeline illustrated, but it still created a new ground. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a lot to take on, and they really are wonderful talks. I think one thing that I don't know if it's an answerable question right now, but there seems to be, maybe it just relates to this comment about a skepticism of certain scales. I mean, I wonder if you could qualify what is the appeal, not for you, but for others, of a planar pattern, an elevational pattern, which, we can understand from your presentation that it's about figure legibilities and reading the pattern or reading the ambiguity. But then in the context of your conversation, I'm really curious why we talk about an urban pattern. So like the example of the Venice Hospital, which is a lovely example, and I get it, but then I'm sort of curious, why would something that is graphic, something that is about ocular legibility as a pictorial surface, be the adequate means of trying to describe very large scale things, maybe bigger than the hospital, like urban scale? Why would pattern be the way you would want to talk about, I don't know, large scale construction or the construction of a city, not in relationship to your argument about pattern, because it seems to would be not possible to find legible in the same pictorial way that the elevational ones were.
Right, which is why I was arguing against it. Because pattern is sort of evolved into something that is out of control. It's reaching a sort of hyperindexicality. You can't read it unless it is at the ocular view, so that's why I'm trying to bring it back to the local condition and then giving that a sort of sense of three-dimensionality so that it is read, it could be read both planarly and then embodied in the round.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thanks.